Blackwood's whispers. Some places wear their age like a badge of honor. Blackwood Cottage, nestled deep within the forgotten folds of the English countryside, wore its history like a shroud. To Eleanor and Thomas, an urban couple in their mid-30s, it was to be a fresh start, a dream painted in moss and ancient stone. They saw charm. The cottage, perhaps, saw new sustenance. It began with the move. The old house, grand and sprawling, swallowed their possessions in a dusty tide. Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, wrestled with a particularly heavy box. She remarked to her husband that the place was so huge, she wondered if they'd need a full-time staff just to dust it all. Thomas, however, was already enchanted. His artistic soul found inspiration in every ancient beam, every uneven floorboard. He smiled, looking around with a genuine awe, declaring the cottage perfect, filled with character, history, and endless creative possibilities. He ran a hand over an intricately carved wooden mantelpiece, lost in thought. Eleanor, always grounded, playfully scoffed, suggesting the history was mostly just a lot of spiders. She swore she'd seen one the size of her fist in the pantry already. Thomas laughed, but then a subtle frown creased his brow. He glanced towards a dark corner of the living room, asking Eleanor if she'd heard it too, a sort of scuttling sound. Eleanor dismissed it, attributing it to his vivid imagination, or perhaps that monstrous spider. They continued unpacking, utterly oblivious to the subtle currents stirring beneath the surface of their new home. A week later, the first unsettling incident occurred. One evening, in the cozy but distinctly old-world kitchen, Eleanor brewed tea while Thomas sketched quietly at the table. She reached for her car keys, only to find them missing from their usual hook. She knew she'd left them there. Thomas, absorbed in his art, simply suggested she'd probably just misplaced them, still getting used to the cottage's layout. Eleanor sighed, a muttered frustration escaping her as she searched. She eventually found them, not on the hook, but tucked inexplicably inside a teapot on the counter. She couldn't help but exclaim, half joking, half annoyed, that sometimes she thought Thomas did things just to annoy her. Who puts keys in a teapot? Thomas looked up, genuinely confused, assuring her he certainly hadn't. Perhaps, he offered, it was a housewarming prank from the previous owner. Eleanor chuckled, shaking her head, choosing to believe it was just a strange quirk of an old house. The tea was ready. The first whispers of unease are often dismissed as quirks, as forgetfulness, as the charming eccentricities of an old house. But the cottage knew its purpose, and its resident knew how to begin its insidious work. Weeks passed, and the gentle hum of rural life began to give way to something far more unsettling. One dark night, Eleanor lay awake in bed, trying to find sleep. Thomas was already lost to dreams beside her. Then, a distinct floorboard creaked loudly from the hallway, pulling Eleanor sharply from the edge of slumber. She whispered Thomas's name but received no response. Another creak. Then, a soft, persistent scratching sound seemed to emanate from inside the heavy wooden wardrobe. Eleanor pulled the duvet tighter, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stared at the wardrobe, cold dread creeping into her veins. Just as suddenly as it began, the scratching stopped. She slowly closed her eyes, trying desperately to convince herself it was nothing more than an old house settling. The next day, Thomas was in his study, engrossed in his work at a large antique desk. He reached for a specific book on the shelf, but it wasn't there. A frown deepened on his face as he searched the desk, then the floor. He eventually found the book. Folklore and Fairy Tales of the British Isles. Face down, half hidden beneath a rug in a completely different corner of the room. He picked it up, dusting it off, a growing sense of unease within him. The book had fallen open to a specific page, an illustration of a grotesque, shadowy figure with glowing eyes, its title chillingly clear, The Boggart of the Hearth. Thomas began to read aloud, his voice gaining a tremor as he absorbed the ancient words. A malevolent household spirit, often attached to a particular place or family. It feeds on fear and discord, escalating from minor mischief to outright torment, growing stronger with every argument, every anxious thought. He slowly lifted his gaze, scanning the room, a profound chill running down his spine. The words resonated with a disturbing personal accuracy. That evening, the atmosphere in the kitchen was thick with unspoken tension as Eleanor and Thomas ate dinner. Suddenly, a framed photo on the wall, one of them smiling cheerfully, detached itself from its hook with a violent crash, shattering glass across the floor. Eleanor jumped, gasping, demanding to know what that was. Thomas, his voice tight, offered only that it was just the old hook. But Eleanor was past placating. She stared at the broken photo, then at Thomas, her voice laced with rising frustration and a tremor of fear. She told him these old house quirks were getting ridiculous. Her keys, the scratching, now this. And, she confessed, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching them. She swore she sometimes saw movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow darting away. Thomas put down his fork, his expression grim and serious. He confessed he'd seen it too, and that he'd found something in a book. He then told her about the boggart, recounting the terrifying description. Eleanor, however, was still skeptical, almost angry at his suggestion. A boggart? She exclaimed. Was he serious? Was he telling her this house was haunted by some bogeyman because a picture fell? It was absurd, she insisted. He was letting his imagination run wild. But Thomas, frustrated, argued back. It wasn't just that, he countered. Things were genuinely happening. They were arguing more. They were both on edge. Didn't she feel it? The dread. As if in response, a sudden guttural growl echoed from the fireplace, sending a visceral shiver through both of them. It was animalistic, yet profoundly wrong, inhuman. Eleanor's eyes widened, a flicker of raw fear finally entering them. She whispered, "What was that?" Thomas, his voice barely a whisper in return, told her, "It's listening." Skepticism, though a fortress against the unknown, can also be a cage. For Eleanor, the walls of logic were beginning to crack, allowing the cold tendrils of fear to seep in. For Thomas, the ancient stories were no longer just tales, but a horrifying reality taking root in their home. Thomas, desperate for answers, sought refuge and information in the village pub. Nursing a pint at the bar, he couldn't help but overhear two elderly locals, Bert and Gladys, their hushed voices carrying an air of local gossip and ancient wisdom, discussing Blackwood Cottage. Bert remarked that he'd heard the new folks were still at Blackwood, but bless their hearts, they wouldn't last. Gladys agreed, stating that the place always found a way to wear people down. Too much fear in that old place, and the boggart had had too many feasts there over the years. Thomas cautiously approached them, his voice tinged with a mix of apprehension and hope. He politely interrupted, explaining he couldn't help but overhear them and that he lived at Blackwood Cottage. Bert and Gladys exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes conveying years of shared unspoken knowledge. Bert then remarked, "Ah, poor lad. You've heard the stories then? About the old ones?" Thomas confirmed, mentioning the boggart and the book he'd found. Gladys nodded slowly, her voice taking on a grave, knowing tone. She explained that it fed on sorrow and rage, and that misery made it strong. The more you fought it, the more you feared it, the happier it got. She recounted the tale of old man Hemlock, who had lived there for 50 years alone, and had eventually left his wife's rocking chair in the attic for the boggart to rest upon, to appease it. He never got a good night's sleep, she said, until he moved out. Thomas pressed for more information, asking how one might appease such a creature. Bert explained, his voice resigned to the truth of the situation, that you couldn't fight it, son. You either lived with it, or you left. Some say a saucer of milk, or a piece of bread left by the hearth could calm it, or a name. Giving it a name sometimes worked. But sometimes, he added grimly, it just wanted you gone. Returning to Blackwood Cottage that night, Thomas found the house colder, more oppressive than ever. Eleanor was huddled on the sofa, pale and visibly trembling, a blanket wrapped tightly around her. She confessed to Thomas, her voice trembling, that it had moved her jewellery box, putting it in the empty bathtub. And the shadows, she said, were so thick. She swore she'd seen a twisted face in the reflection of the window, just for a second. Thomas sat beside her, taking her hand, his voice a steadying presence amidst her terror. He told her he'd spoken to people in the village, and they had confirmed it. It was a boggart, and it grew stronger with their fear, their arguments. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, the last vestiges of her skepticism crumbling away. She cried that it was real, all of it, and they had to leave, now. But Thomas, ever the one to seek a solution, reminded her that they couldn't just leave their home. He recalled the villagers' advice about appeasement. As if summoned by their conversation, a sudden violent crash erupted from upstairs, like furniture being thrown with immense force. The ancient house groaned under the assault, and a fine dust sifted down from the ceiling. Eleanor screamed, a raw cry of pure terror, insisting it was too strong, that it wanted them gone. A chilling, high-pitched giggle then echoed through the house, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was mocking, triumphant. In the living room, the shadows themselves seemed to writhe, deepen, and press in on them. The truth, when it finally reveals itself, often brings not comfort, but terror. For Eleanor and Thomas, the ancient malevolence of Blackwood Cottage was no longer a superstition, but a palpable, menacing presence that had claimed their peace and now threatened their very sanity. Exhausted and terrified, Eleanor and Thomas stood by the fireplace, their only hope the whispered advice from the villagers. On the mantelpiece, they had placed a saucer of milk and a small piece of bread. Eleanor whispered, asking if Thomas was sure about this, admitting it felt absurd. Thomas responded that what else could they do? They'd tried everything else. It was getting stronger. It knew they were afraid. They had to show it they weren't a threat, that they respected its space. They stood in silence for a long, agonizing moment, staring at the offerings. The air in the room was thick with tension, with palpable dread. Eleanor, her voice barely a whisper, made the offering. She declared that they gave it its due, old one. They meant no disrespect. They only wished to share this place, in peace. Silence. The shadows still seemed deep, but perhaps, just perhaps, a little less agitated. There was no immediate response, no violent outburst. Thomas took a deep, shaky breath, recalling another piece of advice from the villagers. He told Eleanor that they had also mentioned a name. A name could sometimes bind it, or at least acknowledge it. Eleanor asked what name. Thomas, after a moment, suggested something old, something that would honor its age there. He proposed Grimshaw. He spoke the name aloud, Grimshaw. The word hung in the air. For a fleeting moment, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth seemed to radiate from the hearth. The oppressive chill lifted slightly. The shadows in the room receded, just a fraction. A tiny, fragile spark of hope flickered in Eleanor's eyes. She whispered, Did it work? The house remained silent, but the previous malice seemed to have receded, replaced by a tense, watchful stillness. The sounds of their own breathing suddenly seemed incredibly loud. As the final minutes ticked by, the fear did not vanish entirely, but it transformed. It was no longer the active, malevolent torment of a feeding boggart, but the constant, chilling awareness of a shared, uneasy truce. Eleanor and Thomas learned to live with Grimshaw. They left small offerings by the hearth, a fresh saucer of milk, a piece of cake on special days. They argued less, fearful of disturbing the delicate balance. They found a quiet, almost reverent respect for the unseen entity that now shared their home. Blackwood Cottage was theirs, but they were never truly alone. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the eaves and the old timbers groaned, they would hear it, a faint, content sigh from the hearth. A reminder that in this ancient English home, a bargain had been struck, and the whispers of Blackwood would endure.